Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to our very first international conversation in English. Remember, this conversation is going to be in English because we are very happy about our guest today. But I want to start for welcoming Allegra Hangen, which will be our moderator today. Thank you so much, Allegra, for joining us, for being part of this online edition of ULTRAcinema. We are very happy to have you here. Allegra also is an artist, an experimental filmmaker. We show, if I'm not wrong, last year a film of you, and also we have a special screening in Scholl, or the virtual theater. Three of your films, if I'm not wrong. So thank you so much, Allegra, for being here today with us.
Thank you.
And Allegra is gonna help us to guide this conversation with our special guest. I want to start to welcome and thank you to Ryan Ferguson, Vito, Rowlands, Weissbach, and Yousra, Benziane, which are on Ontario, Montreal, Omaha. It's you, Allegra. New York. Sorry, I don't remember where are you, but you will explain us today. I'm really nervous. Sorry, you must excuse my English also. So, but I led you with Allegra. I'm pretty sure we're going to enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your films with us. Without your films, the ULTRAcinema cannot be possible. And I hope you enjoy the conversation. So see you at the end of this. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Misha. And hello to everybody. I am so grateful to be here. I'm also pretty nervous, but I'm more excited to be able to talk with the four of you tonight, both about your films that are showing here in ULTRAcinema this year, and then also more generally about your filmmaking processes that you either went through as you're making these films specifically, or generally in your filmmaking process. And I also want to thank ULTRAcinema for everything that they do for experimental film, not just in Mexico, but especially now with this iteration online. It's really great that we're able to kind of reach a more international audience and get more exposure for experimental films. I love talking with experimental filmmakers because I think the people that kind of dedicate ourselves to making experimental films, or maybe submit to the draw of making experimental films, we're a unique breed, because we all know that experimental filmmaking there's not much money guaranteed in it. So if you're doing it, you're not really doing it for the money or the fame. You're doing it because there's something in you, that like a story that needs to come out in a non-linear narrative, or through an explosion of colors or images. And I totally saw that in the four of your films that are here in ULTRAcinema right now. So I'm not going to introduce you guys. I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves. I see that a couple of you have your pronouns, but if you could also say your pronouns. And then after you introduce yourselves, can you talk us through a little bit of what your personal archives look like? Do you have VHS? Do you have Beta, Super 8, 16 millimeter? What are the things that you're collecting, or even digital, right? And basically, whoever wants to go first, go right ahead. I'm not gonna pick anybody right
now. Okay, I'll go. My name is Ryan Ferguson. I'm an artist from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. which is about 70 kilometers from Toronto. My background is primarily in music composition and specifically in electronic music composition. I came to film working in analog film pretty recently. Only this is actually one of the first finished pieces that I've produced. The piece that's in the festival is called Other Roots. It is kind of an examination of, I like to talk about it in the way that we construct our memories and how our memories evolve over time through storytelling, through our own perspective on incidents, moments in time. So the film kind of works a lot like my music composition process in that I repeat image back on top of itself, superimpose the image on itself multiple times. In musical composition, I like the process because it creates musical counterpoints, ghost melodies, things that you don't expect in the composition. So over the course of the piece sort of disintegrates into itself as the black and white film is overlaid on itself. And that's to simulate how the reality of a memory gets blurred over time. And then at the end of the film, we come out of that process and we're talking, whatever you say this memory is, however you tell the story of this memory is what it has become and may not actually have been what it was. As for my personal archives, I collect just about a bit of everything. So digital, yes, I have a digital archive, but a lot of Super 8. I shoot Super 8 a lot now. I have some found 16 millimeter footage that I've collected. And I do have a large VHS collection hiding as well. So old photographs, I have a slide collection. I work in an art gallery, and a lot of old collection materials were archived in slides. So the way that we would communicate to other organizations was through sharing slides. And so a massive archive of slides was being disposed of. So I have a big slide archive that I'm sort of trying to figure out what to do with now as well. So that's kind of my introduction in a nutshell. I'm really happy to be here. Hi, Yousra. It's nice to see you. I'm really looking forward to talking to everyone about their work, so I'll pass it along.
Great. I can go. Do you hear me? Yes? Okay. Yes, that's funny. I didn't know you were a film director, Ryan, because he animated a festival, a Q&A. So yeah. And by the way, sorry for my English. My first language is French. So yeah, my name is Yousra Benziane. I present Nitrate, which like the summary is when the fireworks inflame the memory of a war survival. So yeah, like I was interested like Nitrate in the form of like film, of course, towards the history of cinema, but also like because it's the common chemistry in bombs and in fireworks. So those are the three aspects that I treat in the movie. I had also a precedent film that was it was called a Special Bulletin, and yeah, like so I am a filmmaker, also editor and stuff like that. And for the personal archive question, so like for films and stuff like that, I don't collect them so much. I collect more like lenses. I had some great found. I will probably talk about it later. So yeah, that's my interest, and also I'm very interested in film. But unfortunately, since I'm more young in my cinema school, it was over. It was 100% digital, so it's a medium that like interests me. But like I never like shot like a whole movie like in the 16 millimeters or something. But it's something I am very interested of. So yeah, that's a little summary.
Thank you. Vito or Josh?
Yeah, I can go. So I'm Josh Weissbach. I live in Connecticut in the U.S. So I've been making experimental films for, I don't know, about like 17, 18 years now. No, I think actually more like 16 years, but it doesn't matter. So I actually don't appropriate much material that I don't shoot myself. So basically all my work is stuff that I shot myself, but I have started to kind of like treat my years of shooting as like its own kind of archive. So actually the film To All Those that I'm showing this year in ULTRAcinema was actually a film I made with a few peers, friends back in 2006. And this is a re-edited version with a much more high definition scan. Back then it was like a crappy standard definition scan and done at my school, and it just didn't look good at all. And so it was a film that I always stuck with me. So I wanted to kind of re-edit it and remaster it, both the sound and the image. So, in a way, like I think of it as something coming from my own personal archives that I've reapproached a little bit. The movie isn't totally different. I think if you saw it back in 2006 and then saw it in 2020, you'd probably think it was the same thing, more or less. But my approach kind of to my films lately is also to reassess what I have in my archives, what I haven't used, or maybe younger films that didn't really have a life, and I kind of mine some of that footage. And then also just in general, like my recent filmmaking process is I haven't had like a really well-established concept when I've been entering some of my recent projects. So I just do a lot of like shooting out in the world and kind of collecting images or sounds. So if I hear something I find interesting, I'll pull up my iPhone, or if I have better sound equipment, with me, record that, or just shoot on the Bolex I have, and then kind of start to get an idea and do a lot of creating in the editing process. So I have actually thought of myself lately as like my process is a lot of collecting, while I'm not. It's like weird because I'm not collecting anything that wasn't mine or created by me, but it is feeling like I'm collecting disparate images that originally have no connection, and then I try to form one in the editing process. So that's my introduction. Thanks.
I think that leaves me. Hi all, very nice to meet you again, or for the first time, Yousra. My name is Vito Rowlands. I'm from Belgium originally, but I moved to Brooklyn, New York about 5 years ago, leaving behind my archive amongst many other things, but bringing along my wife, luckily, so that's good. I'm first and foremost a film historian focused on silent cinema, so that might explain a few things if you get a chance to see the film. So I've worked with archives in a more sort of academic capacity for quite some time, and then I sort of veered into filmmaking and writing myself over the last couple of years, which I think is Entre Les Images, the film that you can see at ULTRAcinema, is sort of one of the first ventures into that realm. It uses this very specific archive of different color processes on 35 millimeter nitrate stock, a collection of about 1,000 films made by the University of Zurich, framed from archives all over the world, disembodied from their films, a lot of them from lost films, or from prints that no longer exist, but only in a few frames. And for me, sort of going through those archives, I'm always looking for a story. Before I was writing and making films, I think it was more of a history that I was looking for, or stylistic trends, or novelties that might have come up. But the more I started writing, I think, and making films myself, the more the sort of narrative strands of the period spoke to me. And in this case, that was all about loss at a very sort of tumultuous time when not only this nitrate film is lost, the films themselves are lost, their stories are lost, but also just the specter of the First World War loomed very heavily in this specific archive, and you can see that in a lot of, just the still images. So I tried to bring those back to life and combine them and see what stuck. And I had the good fortune to work with a composer whom I met at another silent film festival in Chicago, where composers are linked to filmmakers and they score your films. The ACM festival, silent film festival in Chicago. In terms of collecting myself, I have a lot of stereograph cards that live in boxes. It's become more of an archive since I've been separated from it for like 5 years. So it's been living in boxes, and it'll be a sort of reopening and closing of the archives when I get back. There's also a couple thousand DVDs and Blu-rays, because when I was about 16, I started getting rid of my VHS collection, which I deeply regret now. But there was just no space for them. So those have been sort of discarded for that. And then there's also a collection of contemporary books from the 10s and 20s that link into all kinds of narrative tropes that I'm interested in. And I only started shooting or making films a few years ago, but my first venture was on film because of my specific archival interests and because of the, so the materiality and the textural nature of it through Mononoa Ware, a Brooklyn film nonprofit that also deals in hand developing and hand processing. So previous film I shot and hand developed myself, and I've done a few since. But Entre Les Images is a found footage film, later put on a film out on 16 millimeters. So it's a little bit of a different process, but in general, I like to be quite hands-on and see where the chemistry gets me. Sometimes that's entangled in a darkroom bag and you get nice results, and sometimes it comes out blank and you have to sort of embrace that as well.
Great, thank you guys. It's great to meet you all and to hear a little bit about your archives and processes. I think there's some really interesting reflections that happen with our processes and things that we choose to collect and to keep with us. And Vito, I'm really sorry that you had to leave a lot of your archive behind. I know that can be really heartbreaking, especially if you're moving around country to country. So I feel that gets you. So I guess to start, I'd like to get sort of a background for each of you guys. And I just want to pose the question of what brought you to filmmaking. Did you study filmmaking college or on your own? So what brought you to filmmaking, and then more specifically, what brought you to experimental filmmaking?
I don't mind starting for this one, for this round. So I actually, in the middle of high school, I moved from Texas to Connecticut and was trying to really figure out what my interests were. I had tried a few things, and none of it really stuck. And the high school I went to offered a digital image or digital video class, and decided to take that and just really. I guess before that, like the idea of making movies had seemed like this really abstract, like only people that don't exist, but they live in Hollywood somewhere, like made movies. And I just didn't think it was a real thing. So to be able to have iMovie and then quickly Final Cut and it also Adobe Premiere to make something was pretty eye-opening for me. And so quickly decided that I wanted to kind of pursue making movies and see what that meant. And I think just for no like particular reason, because I wasn't really engaging in experimental media at that time. I was just drawn to kind of more experimental processes or trying things out. And then I went to for undergrad, I went to a college, Hampshire College in Western Mass, that has a pretty rich tradition of experimental filmmaking, both in terms of who teaches there and what they show. So very quickly into my time there was seeing a lot of experimental work on 16 millimeter. And was just exposed to a bunch of different groundbreaking work that I had never heard of, never seen, never had access to, and that just kind of like catapulted me into pursuing that. I actually spent 5 years at Hampshire, and was regularly taking film classes and making different works, and knew I wanted to kind of continue pursuing film. So only took a year off from undergrad, and then went to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which also has a long history of experimental filmmaking, mainly in their grad program, and was there for 3 years and continued it. And while my day job is not connected to the film world, part of my happiness is very much connected to continuing to make work. So that's kind of my background, but I struggle where I am now because there isn't much of a film community, and especially not an experimental film community. I'm kind of in between Boston and New York and other places that have these communities. But I think one of the small pluses of the pandemic is that things like this are much more possible. So before, when there was a film festival Q&A, if you weren't there, you didn't participate. But doing something like this and being able to talk to y'all has been a real privilege, and something I got to do more since the pandemic. But it's a kind of mode of art that I'm just really attracted to and feel very free with, and know that I can make what I want to make. And yes, there is no money in it. I think we probably all lose money when we make our movies, but it's so great, and I hope to continue doing it for a long time.
Thank you. Yousra?
Yes, so I had a calling for film since a very young age, but it's something that I put aside. It took a while to decide to put in the first front row of my life. So here in Montreal we have Cégep, which is just after high school and before the university. So I didn't been to cinema there. Even I did the first bachelor in communication digital media, which was it was a new program and very about big data and but in a critical aspect and a theoretical aspect, all the GAFA, like Amazon, Google, Facebook, and stuff. And it was very interesting. I find it very interesting, but so yeah, it wasn't there that I touch. But since I don't know, maybe 17, I always took side courses on cinema. So weekend workshop and stuff like that. So this is how I began, but I didn't touch or shoot an actual film or just touch a camera way after. But anyway, there was a contest in this communication digital media program, because it's the media school of the university, and I made a film in this context, and this film won the first prize, and this was my carte de visite. I don't know if we say that in English, but my my little card to apply to cinema school after. So this is how I began, and yeah. So after I've been I did a second bachelor in the film production to properly know how to manipulate a camera and stuff. And I had two choices, and in Montreal there's two big school of cinema, and there's one where you had to choose a path, director, cinematographer, or editor, and the other is more fine arts, so you don't choose a path. And this I prefer, because for me it's you cannot direct a film if you don't know how to edit. It's everything is so integrated and so it's the couche some level, and it adds, you have an initial idea, and it adds to the story every step of the creation of the movie. So, and this is what I think about experimental cinema is it's very open, it's non-predictable, and it's not very linear, more arborescence, and I know that like my brain works in arborescence and not in a linear way, so it kind of fit me. And yeah, it just like offer a liberty of form and le fond et la forme, which is like content and form, I guess, like the symbiosis between the two. And I think that we can go further with experimental cinema on those terms. So yeah, I guess it's the resume of my parcours. And also I had a little minor in film studies that I did like a bit like during my first bachelor. So yeah, I was very interested, but it took me a while to like be like, okay, I'll put this as my priority.
It's really like deep diving into the abyss when you say, okay, I'm just gonna do experimental. Just, I feel like a lot of us that do work with experimental film, we're also dabbling in other things as well. But I completely agree, especially with needing to know the different. Either you need to know editing and you need to understand what the producing role needs to be able to direct a film. And then with experimental film, you can kind of involve all the other arts as well. So yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Yousra.
Okay.
Ryan?
Yeah, so much like Josh, the concept of being a filmmaker when I was, in high school just seemed such like a faraway foreign concept. There was no entry point into that world in my schooling. I did work, however, in my local video store, so I was the nerdy video clerk who got obsessed with, schlocky cannibal movies and horror movies, which led to, exhausted that side of the video store and started to look at the what was called the foreign film section and growing interest in, art house and world cinema. So I kind of went to film school on my couch as part of my my job that I had through high school and my college years. Like I said, my background is primarily in music. I was a recording and touring musician for several years around North America, and I've toured Europe a number of times as a musician as well. So that was kind of my primary outlet for my creativity for a long time. And film was always just sort of a real interest and passion, but not one that I ever explored as a creative. And then I had a career switch, which actually led to me working as a curator at a museum, primarily with film as my role, which kind of reignited my interest in experimental film. Obviously, being involved in experimental music, I had a lot of connections to experimental film, but I don't think I ever fully immersed myself until I started working in the gallery, and that became sort of a side part of my career where I sort of developed that side of my interests a lot more and have been bringing more experimental work into the gallery that I work at. And through that, obviously meeting with artists, working with artists, getting a better feel for the tactility of analog film, of film and the processes with it. I just picked up a Super 8 camera and started to play around. Super 8 I like because it's quick and easy. It does most of the work for you, and I know it's not cheap anymore. It's definitely not a cheap pursuit, but it feels very free to create. And that idea of I think that idea that Josh was talking about as well, about archives and just sort of collecting images and ideas, experimental film and gives you the opportunity to be that sort of collage artist, that you're finding the pieces that you've worked on that connect maybe your memories, or finding narrative ties between two images that you've captured. and doing that again with adding the music archive that I have, kind of combining all those together has really opened up a new, for me personally, and it's been maybe 3 years since I picked up the Super 8 camera for the first time, and it's really kind of opened up the creative possibilities for me of these archives of things that I have. So I guess that's basically what my sort of resume is that that led to me being interested in experimental film. It's kind of like a lot of things, it's been a bit accidental, but has had lots of really deliberate points along the path. So, which I think is interesting too, and as Yousra said, in that sort of freedom of authorship with narrative and story and image that experimental film offers.
I think my path connects a few dots of things that have been mentioned. There was also an English teacher in high school, in my case, who was very formative, not just in getting me good literature, but also films. So that was something that was sort of handed to me. A lot of silent films, a lot of 1930s Hollywood. And at the same time, I was working in a video store locally because I was a little obsessed, started collecting things. But I couldn't see myself doing any of the creative part of filmmaking just because there didn't seem to be any avenues. Belgium is very much a country in which people go to high school and then they immediately go into college, whether it's for filmmaking or other things. And I didn't feel like I was ready for any type of thing like that, that, had that sort of creative dimension to it. So it only took me like 15 years later to think for myself that I was sort of ready to approach creative filmmaking. There was a lot of studying film in the middle, getting a PhD and working on different projects that had to do with film and visual arts. One of them is a book on statues in cinema and how they're sort of, appropriated in the mythology of cinema, and then how the mythology of visual arts is appropriated in its own way. And so in that way, we sort of spoon-fed a lot of things that are, in hindsight, are experimental, whether it's sort of Dreyer's approaching of the sculpture of Thorwaldsen, or, light sculptures made in the 1920s by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So there's a lot of things that I didn't necessarily consider to be experimental, but sort of part of a bigger spectrum of film history. And I guess in a way, various experiments, but things that had a platform at certain times, whether in cine clubs or other things. And it was only through when moving to New York with the idea of also being removed from former work and former bosses and meeting people that were into much more creative endeavors. I think that I sort of opened myself up to that possibility, which started with writing short fiction work to poetry, which is also sort of what made its way into Entre Les Images. And then from that, interacting with other filmmakers who were doing mostly fiction work. But then when I got a camera in my hands at a 16mm workshop, the first thing I did was seek out a statue at a local cathedral and sort of attack that and create a narrative around that. Again, I wasn't necessarily thinking of as experimental, but everyone who watched it assured me that it was experimental or / unwatchable, depending on what vantage points they had. And I just really, I do more straightforward fiction work as well, or I'm starting to get into that. I teach film history at Columbia University here, silent film specifically. But I started going to school again for filmmaking at Brooklyn College, the more affordable counterpart for filmmaking. And they've allowed for a very sort of individual parkour where I can keep combining these things and basically have a very personal outlet of filmmaking in Super 8. Recently bought my first Super 8 camera, which was a big step as opposed to keep renting it or getting it from people. Continuing to work on 16 at the local Brooklyn film nonprofit, where they sort of let me, very slowly develop and cut films, to also shooting things with sort of bigger crews. Because, the fame and money that you mentioned in the beginning, it does sound kind of good. But yeah, you're right. I don't think it will come from these pursuits, but I think these are essentially the most fulfilling. Like it's it's sort of an enclosed little world that you create where a little bit, as Yousra said as well, oftentimes you're the writer, director, editor, producer. If there's voiceover involved, you might also be doing that. In this case, I didn't want to do that because although French is one of my mother tongues, it's gotten pretty terrible over the last years. So I asked a good friend from Belgium to do that for me. But yeah, it just feels like there's endless possibilities and endless traditions to build onto, endless things to take inspiration from. Archives have definitely been my first go-to, and I'm trying to, I think like Josh and Ryan, build more archives of my own that I can sort of interact with. I think, especially in creating your own body of work and then looking at it from different angles. I like the way that Josh was speaking about approaching it also as sort of an archive by years or by dates. And there's something to, building on that and creating your own traditions and through lines with that. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to, since I'm still sort of very early on in that approach.
Yeah, that's a great point of talking about the archives in time. And I kind of want to talk about archives in space as well, or place. When I was watching the 4 of your films, I found this line that kind of went through the 4 of them, which was understanding the notion of place. Where in Josh's film, it's more of like this sort of meditation on a city, or I saw it as kind of like a city ritual, right? Where like we're expected to be interacting with the city in a certain place, but the camera, the eye kind of just is wandering instead of like following the crowd or going to being in the hustle and bustle that is New York. Was that filmed in New York?
It was actually shot in the Loop in Chicago.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and then
but similar to New York.
It had some very similar shots to what I would relate to New York. And then with Yousra's film, it's really talking about, or to me, it seemed like it was talking about the push to assimilate to your new place, to a new home, and it might be triggering some really like cultural celebrations might be triggering trauma to a group of immigrants that it's just not really common knowledge to people that are living in that place already, or that are from that place and they're used to that sort of cultural celebration. And I mean with fireworks and those sounding like bombs, right? In Vito's Entre Les Images, I'm so bad with French. It was really thinking of place as like where cinema resides. It's more of this metaphorical place where cinema resides between like images and memory. And then I saw in Ryan's film sort of just traversing through space. It felt like I had given like all autonomy to walk. I was just following these train tracks being led with the soundtrack through a space or through place. So I'm wondering if you guys could talk a bit about how place, people that live in that place, influence or add something essential to your films and your filmmaking, your process.
I can go. So yeah, me, how Nitrate like was born. It was very much related to the location I live. So I live very, very close to where the fireworks like explode, and it's like twice a week, like for like 1 or 2 months during the summer. So it's pretty like present in my life. And I remember, and when it it goes, and if you don't go outside, enjoy the show, you know, it's like pretty invasive. It's like super intense, and for sure I had those links with the war, and I had a friend that had a teacher that lived war, and he was like he forbidden you know, like binders, because like this, just the little sound of binders, it reminds him of like the detonation of a grenade, and it declenched a PTSD for him. So I was like, okay, wow, if like this little sound could do that to him, what can do like big fireworks, you know? So this was like the first like sparks of what led me, like the intuition that led me to this movie. So yeah, and after, well, there was a whole research with like people that live war. I concentrate my effort on like Syrian refugees, because it's very it was very contemporary issue in Montreal and in the whole world, and also Lebanese, so very Middle East. So I interview a lot of those people, and yeah, there was one person that we worked more together, and we did like a work that is kind of more close to poetry than like interview or something like that, to really like you know, like so the film can become like experiential, so like the person that is watching can like feel how it is to be in his mind. So that was the approach for the movie. And for the archive aspect of it, I asked to Carl Lemieux, which is pretty famous for his found footage work and just film work in general. And yeah, so I just, because he have an archive, you know, so I asked him like, I did like a little shot list, if we can say, like, okay, this could be interesting, like war, fireworks, blah, blah. And yeah, like, so he found some stuff, he proposed to me, we selected together, and that's how we had like the war archive in the movie that we burned together. So yeah.
I'll go. So I've lived in the city of Hamilton for pretty much all of my life. I grew up just outside of the city, but I was born here. And the city is primarily an industrial city, traditionally at least. And the north and south ends of the city are bookmarked by railways. So there's a rail line that runs across the waterfront and one that runs across the escarpment that is on the other side of the city. And they're connected by these little rail pathways that kind of connect north and south of the city and connect the factories on each end of the city to take materials out of the city. So I was always really interested in that space and how it connects directly to the history of the city and the sort of collective memory of what's happened in the city as it's, you know, become one of the fastest growing cities in our country, at the point where Hamilton was far outpacing Toronto in growth at one point in the late 1800s, early 1900s with industrialization, and then falling into what was a deep, deep depression in the 90s when the industrial side of the city starts to fail. It was a steel city. And just thinking about that history that's contained in those tracks. But one of the other things I've thought about more as I start to think about train tracks and my sort of obsession with them is that, you know, train tracks in North America, the building of the railway is essentially the colonializing of the countries of both the US and Canada. And that's the march of colonialism across the country, the march of industrialization across the country, and the march of globalization across the country. So as we're starting to think about, you know, the world that we're inhabiting today, the rails sort of hold so much more history and memory in them, because I'm primarily concerned with memory how memory works. That idea of the memories that are underneath those tracks and have been carried across those tracks is so for me, the space and the physicality of the railway tracks are very, very important. That idea of space and place, and that's what that represents in the film, is that, you know, that collective memory that rolls along the tracks, and how it, I mean in colonialization, it's obviously colonization, it's the memory that has been told to us in history that we now are becoming more and more acquainted with is completely untrue. And so that idea of how memory isn't always a full truth as well, I think is something that I'm fascinated with. And I'm kind of talking around a bunch of ideas because it's a big picture that I've come. I'm the reason I started to get interested in memory is because I don't have much memory from before I was about 15 years old. I don't know why that is, but I pretty much don't have any childhood memories. And my childhood memories are stories my family tells, pictures I have, and I know that's not completely not unnormal or unnatural, but it's just interesting to see that my memories only exist in the way that they're given to me, and so that's why I kind of have this interest in how memory works and develops. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it kind of talks like really about what the space and the places are and the significance of that to me in my film.
Yeah, that definitely answers the question. I think it starts to get to the sort of esoteric side of place and space that I'm personally interested in, as well with memory. I think places, and especially objects like steel and things that built with hands, do contain a lot of memory of the people that either built them or were there in the time. And maybe less esoteric, metaphorically, it really just shows the priorities that were there in that time, in that space. So yes, that's very interesting. Thank you, Ryan. Josh or Vito, do you want to take the mic?
I was going to see who would draw more quickly, but I guess it's me this time. Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think in my case, it started with a character, and a character that sort of grew from the idea that specifically what I was looking at was a collection of things that were somewhat ephemeral, not it was not possible to touch these things for most people, only by very specialized film professors with certain levels of access to the deepest cellars of film archives where the nitrate is held, and you get to take a picture for 2 seconds, and that idea of not just having that be a specific space, but that this whole collection of maybe 1,000 films, of which I think 100 maybe made its way into into my film Entre Les Images. This idea that it belongs to a period that's now only sort of lives on in certain artifacts or memories. In terms of films, most often presented at the wrong speeds, without the right color, without any type of cultural context, or if there is any cultural context. Oftentimes that's wrong too. Maybe that's just a sort of pet historian peeve, but it just sort of summarizes a whole generation of people whose lives are lost, who only live on in these specific artifacts or between the specific artifacts, not necessarily always in them. And from that, I grew this character who tried to engage with this material and with the sense of loss on a more personal level. So extracting that to a love story, but then also Allegra, as you mentioned, sort of metaphorically about all of whatever we're collecting, whatever we're archiving, whatever we're making. To quote the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, what will survive or what will be left of it, something like that, I think. Who's going to see it? How is it going to be contextualized? We really have no idea. Will someone repurpose it for their own experimental film, or speed it up and show it on television and say, hey, look, this is how people looked at things in the year 2020. So I think that's sort of how, you know, how this specific place that you see in the film, which is really a lot of places, a lot of spaces, a lot of countries, a lot of archives that have films that don't belong to their countries, to sort of unify that and again and try to make it something that speaks to, you know, the character that evolved from it, and then the character that, you know, one of us or our generation will eventually become, which sounds like an incredibly depressing and misanthropic way to look at it. But it's, I guess, sometimes hard not to when dealing with this, you know, with this sort of idea, like how does imagery reflect on a generation, and you know, what do we make of that? How do we repurpose that? And how fast can we completely lose sight of what it was originally? How much do we really have any idea of what it was like? And I'm endlessly fascinated by that. So I think this was sort of my first attempt at engaging with that, and I hope to make many more that, you know, can live on as their own stories.
Yeah, you know, it's difficult sometimes to think back to the original concept of this film, you know, knowing that it was originally made so long ago. And, you know, I think at the time, myself and the two other filmmakers involved in the original creation were kind of really focused on like a visual poetics. You know, I think that's what, you know, of the city, of that place. So I think that's what drew us into that specific process. And you know, I think it doesn't totally matter. It didn't matter to us what city it was, whether it was Chicago or New York or, you know, another place that could serve as a placeholder. But you know, I think really just kind of focusing on that visual poetics. And I think at the time I was, you know, had just gotten introduced to Stan Brakhage, and I was really influenced by his film The Wonder Ring, which is a film that he shot in New York of an elevated train. And so there's actually a shot in To All Those that of the train that really kind of resonates with me from that Brakhage film. But you know, I find the question you ask really interesting, because soon after I made this film, and I consider it a formative film, like early on in my experimental filmmaking years, I had like my whole process shifted a lot to focusing on space and place in general. I actually have a whole series of films called The Addresses that deal with both real and imaginary spaces. First real, and now they're getting more and more imaginary. But you know, a lot of that was driven by my influence by Gaston Bachelard's book, The Poetics of Space. And in that book, I think he talks about this idea of topoanalysis, which is the study of the intimate spaces of our lives. And so I think that has really, you know, when I start to think of when I became more interested in conceptual ideas in filmmaking, that was really formative to me, and has lingered with me this whole time. And I don't know if some of those early ideas were embedded into all those, but you know, it's definitely something that has informed so much of my work since To All Those. And at that time, it was actually called To All Those Who Have Been There Before. And so in the re-edit there, I cut off part of the title, because in my mind it was just always considered To All Those. But I think, you know, so I think maybe that original film was less about space and place, but it was part of a formative trajectory that my more recent work is definitely interested in those ideas.
Great, thank you. I really like that comment about Bachiard's Poetics of Space, and thinking about the intimate moments that we are able to capture either on film or in our archives, or to collect from other people, like in family albums or family films, the ways that we're able to access intimate spaces and intimate moments through cinema. I'm wondering if you guys have any any part of your process that it's really looking at kind of diving into these intimate spaces, maybe through history, or through, Josh, like you just were talking about with address films. Is there anything that's sort of trying to get into that intimate space of other people or of yourself even?
I mean, I don't mind just jumping into that because you know, a lot of my films, not all of them, but a lot of my films from the Address series deal with a lot of you know, I'd say personal trauma or trauma that is familial. So you know, I think that I find trauma interesting because I think it takes intimate spaces and turns it somewhat like into the uncanny. And so that's something I've been really attracted to. And, you know, and I think early on it was more literal of like, okay, I'm making a film about, you know, one of my grandparents who are dying and how their relationship to their house because of dementia is really changing and their memories are getting muddled and they're you know, combining in their mind different spaces from childhood and later in life, and more recently it's kind of maybe a more abstract approach to the idea of what home is, and I think the Address film that I'm just starting to work on right now, and it's kind of similar to like the process I talked about earlier about right now I'm just doing a lot of collecting, but I am interested like in this idea of homelessness, but how do you show the home when there isn't a home? And that's also has a kind of a personal narrative connected to it. But I think so much of my work has been personal that I'm trying to bring in maybe other intimate moments from other people or other sources into it, to not weight it so much in me, but maybe make it feel a little bit more universal, because I think a lot of the trauma that my Address films speak about in terms of space or place are, you know, you could put anyone's narrative in that or familial narrative in there, and it can be switched pretty easily. So yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else have something to interject here?
Yeah, I can. I think I can just bounce off of that. I don't think I could say it better than Josh, but the idea of making something personal, uniquely personal, deeply personal, that you know that is universal at the same time, I think is a very interesting notion. And I think also sort of, you know, summarizes what the best of films and experimental films can do. I think it's something that I'd love to engage with at a later time in, you know, whatever this sort of journey into experimental film is. I think now I'm using sort of a placeholder for that, but even there, I think you can. It's almost impossible not to put specifics into these types of works. But yeah, I think that engaging with the personal trauma and potentially also the personal archive, and then grounding that in a certain place, or in Josh's case, in a certain address, even. I think that's a fascinating way of approaching that, and yeah, something that I hope to similarly be able to do at one point. But I think it's a very hard thing to do.
Yes, yes, I do also find that it's a hard thing to do. Like intimacy, it's such a like towards others, like to collect the intimacy of others is super difficult. And you know, just like in my interview, it can be awkward because it's like, okay, I bring the microphone, so it's now that the intimacy should happen. Kind of, and you know, like there's long-term encounters, but also short terms, and yeah, to reach an intimacy in short term, it's quite a challenge. And in the other way, like the intimacy within herself, like it's super easy to reach, but it's more difficult to like exhibit or express, you know. So yeah, for sure, for me, it's a challenge that I navigate, but an interesting one, and a one that it's worth it.
Yeah, Yousra, I was interested in how you would have kind of driven that situation, especially if you're talking about such intense PTSD trauma from people in an immigrant community that's sort of dealing with things firsthand and having really traumatic reactions to the new place that they're in. So yeah, I can imagine that it's a very difficult line to walk when you're kind of having these interviews. Did you have many interviews with various people in the immigrant community, or how was the process there?
Yeah, I had like different one, like some solo, some more like let's say 2 or 3 people, family. I did even one because I am quite interested in collective interviews, because like it's a collective experience war, and like they can share and bound on each other. So I thought it was a good idea. But so I gathered like 2 families together and like for a chat. But like I couldn't get any Jews. I couldn't like there was something awkward, but I couldn't like say what. But it's only like when the interview like was done that that one of the family was like, oh, they are like the other family is very the contrary of our political belief. Like one was like pro the president and the other was like anti. And it wasn't in the question that I spoke, but or like even if the question was in another topic, like one family like talked about it, and it just shut the other family, and there was a tension. It's only like after the interview that they told me and that I could. So yeah, it's very touchy, and I had like an intention of like collective sharing, but it doesn't always work and stuff like that. So I'm still navigating in like in that there's not one recipe for sure.
Yeah, even though we're talking about well, now we're sort of on the topic of family things and intimate spaces, but the political nature of everything will sort of infiltrate into those conversations no matter what. So, props to you to pioneering into it, just
yeah, I learned a lot.
it ended up being a little awkward at some point there. I'm sure there's some really interesting sound bites at the least that you're able to get there. Ryan, were you going to say something?
I feel like the other 3 participants spoke so well to the topic that I don't know what I have to add. Specifically, I have a film I made last year on just out of the blue. I was in Japan and I was visiting. So this is actually sort of observing others' lack of intimacy with space made me really want to engage in this space. I was at the Fushimi Inari Temple, which is the famous red torii gates that lead through that temple, and I just was watching people's lack of real engagement with that area, that space. It's a photo for your Instagram feed. So I decided then that I had enough film with me that I would take 2 steps and shoot a still frame of the entire 4 or 2.5 miles up around the mountain of the space, and try and get as intimate with the space as possible to sort of really document the entirety of what this massive space is, that is a holy space, a really important place. It's been there for hundreds of years. I think the initial gates were built in around the year 715 or something like that. So it's not really answering your question or speaking to that. It was just observing the lack of intimacy that we as a society can have with space, and how images are such a quick thing to capture and to throw into a social media feed, and that's really people's interaction with the spaces around them. So that taking that time to go in and document that space so thoroughly was just something that while I was just standing there, it occurred to me that there's thousands and thousands of people here who aren't engaging with this space in any meaningful way. So again, that's not really adding much to the conversation. It's kind of adding a counter balance to the process, I guess.
Yeah, I think too, though, if we're thinking about a space where people aren't really genuinely, let's say, or intimately interacting with the actual space, even if they are taking an image for their Instagram feed, all those images combined, does that create a sense of place? Does that create a sense of intimacy? Maybe even if we're talking about like the intimacy of social media now. I don't want to get on that tangent, but you know what I mean? Like, I think even if we're not, I think we've kind of passed this sense, maybe is in humanity, of only being able to interact with the space when we're there physically. Like right now, we're able to have this in multiple physical spaces, in actually like intimate spaces for ourselves, but we're able to share it and create sort of, I mean, I was talking before about the archive being able to create these spaces, but we're able to open up the sense of space and how we are interacting with it, maybe in an intimate way, but later, not when we're actually there. I had so many more questions to ask you guys, and I really did want to ask you all specifically one question and then open it up to the group, but the conversation brought us different places, and I think either way, it was really great and super interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on all of these things. So I guess if we can open it up to questions from people watching. Micha, are you there to help us with this? Here we have one question. Is your work being done just for your own purposes, or do you hope for leaving some kind of legacy with any of your films, whether experimental or not? Thoughts on that? Vito?
Yeah, I think the fact that we're all here speaks to the inherent need for us to share this work. Even if it stems from any type of personal interest, I feel like, and again, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but it feels like we're putting something out there for people to hopefully respond to, which for this type of work is not always, something you necessarily can expect. But I'm not sure if that necessarily speaks to legacy, but I do feel like it speaks to maybe what Ryan was saying, either counteracting how other people or how society deals with images or places or concepts, and then sort of adding your own understanding of that through film.
So I don't remember how the question was exactly worded, but I feel like the answer is yes to both questions. Like I do make these movies for my own purposes, and my own like need to creatively express myself, or cinematically express myself. But I think if my films remain after me and there is some kind of like legacy or like some overriding project that people recognize that I did with my film career that is worth like reassessing, whether they know the context or not, or if it's fast forwarded on a TV, years later, I still think that would be great. I've just like, because of the pandemic, was just recently talking to my wife about doing our first will. And a big part of that was like, okay, so if I die from coronavirus, like who am I leaving all my film stuff to? And like, that was actually one of my concerns outside of like what we do with our children and all that. But like, that was actually like my third baby was like my film all my film stuff. So that was really important to me.
I think I agree with what both Vito and Josh said. Is we're sharing the work, so there is a desire to not just to the impulse to create, but to share it with the world. And obviously, I think if you're making something, there is at least some hope that it will leave a legacy of some sort. I would love to. I think the best legacy that I would leave, I think, going on what Josh is saying, is where does my film stuff go when I'm gone? I've picked so many things up from thrift stores and been fascinated with them. Like, I have a record that someone recorded of their wedding, people singing at the, when you could go to a booth and record your own version with your friends of a hit song, like cassettes of things like that. Like, if one of my films was just sitting in a thrift store somewhere and someone picked it up and was amazed, like amazed with this object they found, I think that's as interesting a legacy as any. But yeah, as someone has been so inspired by the random things that I've found, and something like the Searching for Sugar Man documentary or something like that, where you kind of find this person that no one's found. I mean, we're kind of obsessed with that in sort of fringe cultures, is finding this person whose work no one's seen. So that type of legacy of being unearthed by a future generation, I think, is because I've been so obsessed with those types, that would be an appealing legacy for work, rather than a concrete, there's a whole school of thought that's influenced by the work that you're doing today. I think it's more interesting to just be found later.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Yeah, well, I agree with all the gentlemen said. I don't have something more, but yeah, sharing is an important part. I won't see myself doing film just for myself. Like I overthink so much. I don't need I don't need that. Just like that.
Thanks, everyone. We have another question. I see a renewed interest in experimental cinema. Why do you think this is happening? Why the interest in delving into the film archive? Why are you guys interested in delving into the film archive or experimental cinema?
Maybe I have a little theory, but I'm not. Since we are such like like image society, like we receive so much image, so much stuff. I think just to receive experimental is like, it's like something fresh, something that people never experiment or never seen. So maybe that could explain it. But also, it's also a question that I have a question, like from where you feel that, because I think with internet it's so difficult to know if like there's a trend or something, because it's so like echo chamber, we are all in there. So yeah, also like from where you ask this question, but yeah, that would be my little theory, if there is you interested in experimental cinema.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think if I'm reading what Yousra is saying correctly, then I would say yes. There's, because of this sort of explosion of imagery everywhere, and we have it at our fingertips, there's a need to connect with something that's, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can taste almost. I think experimental film has a lot of that to offer. It's very textural. It's something that a lot of us engage with our hands, whether it's through holding the finished developed print or loading the film or developing it. At the same time, I feel like because of the explosion of the short form of filmmaking online, and with short, I mean from like 10 seconds to 2 minutes, and the resources you have to do it, I've been giving my silent cinema students every year since the last 5 years since I arrived here, like an assignment to compare old to new. So looking at new apps, looking at short form filmmaking, the idea being like, what's the latest technology you have and what can you do with it? You know, and compare that then to the very first Lumiere films or some experiments that, you know, nobody remembers, like the Skolanovsky brothers or others who were experimenting with cinema, and what comes out of that. And if you look at a lot of the internet culture surrounding moving images, a lot of that is just inherently experimental. I think it's that the echo chamber effect. Something looks cool or funny or shocking, and then you go down a rabbit hole of, all right, well, what if I sort of put a few twists on that? I feel like almost everything I see pass on my phone is extremely experimental, but not everyone connects it to experimental filmmaking. It's seen as maybe a little more, but I think it certainly helps. I think people can see something and think, oh, this is a work of art, or it's a piece of media that can be consumed, and so it's less strange. Like you wouldn't only see it in a specialized movie theater, or you would need a projector and then get it yourself and then screen it, or it's just much more accessible in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, right off what Vito said, I think access is basically all of it. Like I think of when I first started getting into experimental film, it was like you can watch it on 16 millimeter, or there's a really crappy VHS scan of it. Like maybe there were a few makers on, you know, that had DVDs, or there were collections, and outside of that, it was like you need to go to festivals and go to these kind of like more privileged spaces that you had to travel to, you had to attend. And I think you know, the way the internet continues to explode and makes the world smaller and smaller. I mean, I just even think of like ULTRAcinema being an example of so many other festivals that are like have pretty young traditions of like 3, 4, 5 years that are popping up all over the world. And before it was like US and Europe mainly for these experimental festivals, but now we have all these other festivals kind of across the world that are tapping into certain experimental cinema traditions in those own countries that we don't know about, and then are also having conversations with other festivals. I mean, I know ULTRAcinema has done such a good job of conversing with other Latin American experimental film festivals that, like, I think without the internet and the access, and then also like the kind of like artist run film lab movement that we're seeing, you know, I think a lot of that is such a big part of it. And, you know, I think I agree with what everyone else is saying. It's just, you know, I think it used to, experimental film used to feel like really, really niche to me. And it still is niche, but it does feel like the world is getting smaller while also getting bigger. And I just think the ability to see the work is so much easier now, you know, partially with YouTube, partially with Vimeo, you know, partially just with all the different social media apps that do have kind of experimental aesthetics that are being used. And whether that is current work or delving into a certain archive, I mean, you know, the internet can be terrible, but can also be really helpful for things like this.
I agree with everyone. I don't know what else I can really add to that. I think maybe the only thing is that the desire to discover something new and different is driving maybe a lot of people to the end that this sort of shrinking of the world is allowing. But yeah, Josh definitely, I think probably with the most experience attending the longest experience attending film festivals, I think he's got it pretty much right. That's yeah.
Are there certain communities, or I'm not reading the question. I'm going to ask my own question right now. Are there certain communities or institutions that you guys have felt that are really supporting artists in experimental film, either in the process or festivals or liberating archives to allow for more access to either see the films or to make your films with these archives?
I think since my microphone was still live, I figured I'd just go right into it. In where I'm located, with close proximity to Toronto, the LIFT, the Liaison of Independent Filmmakers in Toronto, has been very supportive. There's Pleasure Dome. There was the Toronto Open Screenings. There is the 8 Fest, which is a Super 8 film festival, which is a great festival. I think there's a very good community, that there are resources in place definitely in Toronto for that. Niagara Custom Lab is in Toronto, where a lot of commercial film developing takes place. So I think that access point exists pretty in a great way in Southern Ontario, where I'm located. Where I am here in Hamilton, I can see it starting for sure. I'm part of a group who's about to launch a community darkroom project, and with the express purpose of starting to teach people hand processing and experimental film techniques here in the city. So I think it's more people are getting the means into their hands to do things everywhere. So I'm guessing that most everyone in the chat is going to have a similar organization near them, or one that they can mention that is doing that work.
Yes, in Montreal, there's a main film that is like they have a lot of equipment that we can rent. There's Le Trou Noir, but it's more a bit photography, like a darkroom. They offer like medium format workshop and stuff like that. Also Double Négatif, which I think Carl Lemieux is part of. And yeah, so it's a small community, but alive. Yeah.
I think you're in it's interesting because I recently met, I think, the first people working in this sort of environment in Belgium through the network here in New York, Mana no Aware specifically, which has such a low threshold for film workshops and has a very, very impressive team of people flyering the entire city, which is how I originally stumbled upon them. I don't think you can find a coffee shop that doesn't have like 60mm workshops on the sort of yellow and black flyer paper that it's just impossible not to see them. And then there is just a whole host of community darkrooms and some new, like very, very tiny film labs sprouting out of, I feel also specifically Mana no Aware, which also works with Kodak, who now has a lab in Long Island City, and then things like Metropolis Post and more commercial houses. So there's definitely, like, I think, an entire networks that connects all the way to, Cinelab in Boston, Color Lab, and then obviously straight up to Toronto. My first festival with my previous film and with my first film was the Artifact Festival in Calgary, and I was really surprised to see specifically how like Canada has such an impressive network of these communities, whether it's in Montreal or Toronto or Calgary, where I wasn't expecting any of that, and has been so supportive of international artists like myself as well. And it's funny that's the way I have to find myself back to a film lab in Belgium that no one knows exists and is run by one person. So
yeah, I think so much of the tradition of experimental cinema continues to be inspired by the model of microcinemas. I mean, there are all the festivals that people see stuff, but there are so many filmmakers who've taken their work on the road because it's so hard to show, and there's these very little community-based microcinemas, whether it's in a bar or someone's basement or a different community space. I've been involved in a couple of microcinemas, and a number of you have mentioned them, or things that are similar to that. And then the film labs have taken on similar models. So there is, I think, that tradition of microcinemas, I think, just kind of continues throughout the whole kind of experience of experimental cinema globally, which sounds really large, but I think it's just something that in kind of like a quaint way has continued to exist. I mean, Brian, obviously from being Canada, and then Vito talking about, I mean, Canada does such a good job of having so many experimental film festivals that don't charge submission fees, which I think is such a big deal. And that model has been copied in a lot of European festivals. I mean, not copied, but similar. And then, basically every country but America like provides a lot of free submissions, and I feel better about submitting to a festival that's gonna not ask for me to pay to submit if I know they can't pay me back. Whereas you have so many American festivals and some of the bigger European ones charging money with nothing in return. So that's kind of like the shitty exploitative part of it. But I think with like the micro cinema model, it's like we can't really give you money because we don't have any money, but we give you a chance to show your work and get to know our community. And you can, we're all going to drink during the screening, and you're going to get to know more people. And here's a place to crash before you go to the next micro cinema. So I feel like that is really, really helpful. But yeah, Canada really does kill it. I've actually been the Artifact Film Festival that you're referring to, Vito. It actually has only been Artifact for a few years. It was a $100 film festival before that, and I visited when it was still $100, and they are lovely up there, and it's great to have a festival like right at the kind of nestled in the mountains, which is, the mountains are a little bit further away, but that area is so lovely.
And the Winnipeg Underground
Woof,
Film
yeah.
Festival is another one.
Aaron and Scott, yeah, they're killing it.
Yeah.
Hopefully in a iteration in the next years of ULTRAcinema, we can enjoy together and drink together and celebrate as well.
Yeah, will be amazing to have you here in Mexico. And as you may know, ULTRAcinema is moving around the country. So last year we went to Oaxaca. 2 years ago we went to Veracruz. This year are intended to be in Tepic, but because of this thing we cannot make it. But we are virtually from Tepic, Nayarit. Next year we are keeping the surprise for the very very last day. But I don't want I don't want to be the killjoy. I'm sorry. This conversation is so interesting, but everything has to have an end. But before we leave this conversation, we have one more question. So please, I found it really interesting.
What is the most out-of-the-box technique or idea that you've used in your work, and how do you measure if it was successful or not? It's a very interesting question.
Oops, I can jump in. So yeah, what inspired Nitrate was some 60s film from Jean-Claude Labrec, which worked at the National Film Board of Canada. And he did like 2 films with a very long lens. It was like a NASA lens, like a 1000 millimeters lens. And I really liked the aesthetic and thing. And I was like, oh, for Nitrate, I really want to shoot with a long lens. So I Ryan know what is coming. So I very like naively, I was like, okay, I'll check on Kijiji, which is like Craigslist, to see if there was some long lens, but with no hope. And I found this way, I found a 800 millimeters lens, and I can show it to you guys. It's super huge. It's like a missile. So I was super stoked, but it's like so much like adapter and stuff. So we tried to put it on a digital camera, but it was a bit like it could be damaging for the camera and for the lens. So we didn't shoot with it, unfortunately. We ended shooting with a 600 millimeters, which are way less big nowadays. And we put like a doubleur, which like double the millimeter of the lens. So yes, I'm very happy with the results because we can have like very wide, when we were from very far away, we have very wide shot of the fireworks, because fireworks are so big and stuff, and we were so far away. But at the same time, we have very close up of spectators of the fireworks, like super, super close up. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it.
I don't mind going. So actually, a film I made a couple years ago that I think ULTRAcinema showed for all audiences. It was I used to work in a movie theater in Western Mass that was still projecting 35 millimeters. So I when I was done, I took a bunch of like old or a bunch of their movie trailers that they were going to toss out, and for about a year, I was just kind of slowly cutting pieces of the trailers and putting them into a mason jar with avocado. And as the avocado would mold, it would eat the emulsion off, and then I would take film out and put new film in. And like as the emulsion or as the avocado got like moldier and grosser and maggots started to form, the emulsion would be eaten away like super quick, like within hours. Whereas like the first, it would take a few days, and it was a difficult like stomach process for me having to clean the film and like take the gross avocado off. But that was probably one of my weirder techniques that was not totally film based, but more organic material based.
I think, yeah, I can. I'm not sure if I tried out something today, actually. I came from a film shoot, but let me see if I can still find it. I have the right thing here.
Oh, and I forgot something. I just wanted to add. What was crazy? It's because when I go to the shop, like the person was telling me that the photographer that had this lens, he used it like in planes during the World War II to know where to shoot. So, and since my film is about war, I was like, oh, everything is in everything. So yeah, I was very excited in the beginning. Continue, Vito.
Yeah, today I was experimenting with this liquid metal, which is used in kids' experiments called gallium, which I hadn't heard of, but we're trying to repurpose a shot by Cocteau in one of his Orpheus films. I think someone puts his gloves into like liquid mercury, which we were not going to do because it's very toxic and deadly. It has to be heated up to a certain amount, but this just turns liquid at room temp. So it's basically like a liquid mirror. So I'm curious to see how that comes out. And I've been meaning to apply it to film stuff along with like these things that we found, like a deceased relatives with it, which are sort of like they're halitoon farben. So it's like dye that specifically could also be applied to film, like tinting and toning, and creates these specific types of halftones, but they must be from like the 30s. So there's like a whole box with specific. It's kind of like those old tinting and toning catalogs that you could get in the silent period. I'm curious to see at any type of festival that's sort of a possible measure of success. But if I get anything out of it, I'll be very happy.
I don't know that I have a specific experimental technique or something I've tried. In the film that's in the festival, Other Roots, and I've done a couple other films with this where it's like I'm shooting basically still frames as I'm moving, and it's typically worked out in mathematics, but I did do one that was a single take Super 8 where I decided to take the shots based on my heart rhythms. And as I'm walking, shooting a Super 8 cartridge has about 3,600 frames in it. So taking 3,600 shots in a row is a long walk. So I started to, as my heart rate was going up, I thought the experiment was kind of interesting in a standard playback because the distance traveled would fluctuate with my heart rate. I don't know that it was really a complete success, but I thought it was an interesting way to take what I've kind of worked out as a sort of set formula of how I would do something and add a complete variable into it. So I think that's one of the fun things about experimental cinema is you can try something just like that. And sometimes, yeah, mixed results, but it was interesting to try.
Thank you, everybody.
No, it's amazing just to learn your tricks, and this speaks with us. It speaks to us about the freedom of experimental filmmaking, because we can make films with whatever we found on your way, and that's why we love share these works. I don't know, Allegra, if you have something more to say before.
Well, I mean, I do, but we don't have the time.
Of course, of course. we have a lot of questions, but this will be the pretext to have more conversations in the future. So to continue speaking, to continue connecting. That's why we wanted to do something like this, because this was unique opportunity to have you. Probably we never have the budget to bring you to fly you to Mexico, but on the good side of this thing, we can have this wonderful conversations with you, and get to know you more, and you know more about us, and because we love your films. We are doing this without almost zero budget, just because we love your films, and just because we love sharing these amazing works, sharing your passion for doing films. No matter if you as you almost all say that we are losing money with doing this, but because we just love it. We cannot stop doing it. So thank you so much. Sorry, Allegra, I interrupt you. Maybe I don't know. I'm so excited.
But I did want to thank you all for conversing with me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you so much, Yousra. Thank you so much, Vito. Thank you so much, Ryan. And of course, thank you so much, Allegra, for having this conversation, this amazing conversation. I hope you continue to stay in touch with the festival. Our doors are open to have your films. By the way, we love your film. Just the last one. I just mentioned it. Sorry, I forget the title. The festival ends on Sunday, so we have a lot of more films, a lot of more competition. We will have another English conversation on Thursday. And of course, our final closing conversation on English, also with the director of closing film, When Forever Dies. So please, I hope you can join us for the next days. So thank you so much. Take care. Use your masks. Stay safe, please, because we need your talent for future generations. So have a good night. Much. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.